Hi, my name is Claire Matthews. I'm 61 years old, and for most of my life, I thought of myself as quiet, dependable, the kind of woman who stayed in the background to make sure everyone else was happy. For the last 6 months, since my husband passed, I've believed my only job left was to keep my son smiling and help him feel supported. But 3 days after his wedding, I opened my front door to find my new daughter-in-law standing there in a sharp gray suit, her smile gone and replaced with something I'd never seen before, and a notary public standing silently behind her. She didn't even say hello. She handed me a thick stack of papers and told me it would be easier if I just signed now. Her voice was cool, rehearsed like she was speaking to someone she thought was already beaten. I remember my hands shaking as I flipped through the first few pages, seeing words like trust assets and primary control and realizing what they were asking me to do. I looked up and my son wasn't even there. He had let her come to my home and tell me that my future, my home, my life was now theirs to handle. I stood in my doorway, feeling a kind of disbelief that burned through my grief and settled into something colder, something harder. So I have to ask you, what would you have done if your own son let his wife treat you like a burden if he let her come to your door with a stranger and tell you that you were too old, too fragile, too useless to handle what you'd worked your whole life to build? Would you sign and shrink away, or would you find a way to fight back? After Daniel died, the house went quiet in a way I didn't know a house could. Our old place on Gaston Street had always been full of noise. The soft hum of his radio, the scrape of his chair legs on the kitchen floor, the sound of his voice reminding me to pick up eggs or asking where he'd left his glasses. After the funeral, all of that stopped. The silence settled into the corners of every room like dust I couldn't quite sweep away. I stayed busy at first because it was easier than sitting in that quiet. I watered the hydrangeas every morning and folded the same linens I'd already folded just to keep my hands moving. The evenings were the worst. I'd catch myself making 2 cups of tea out of habit, only to pour one down the drain. Sometimes I'd stand in the doorway of our bedroom and stare at the empty space on his side of the bed, trying not to cry. The only thing that kept me going was Lucas. My son called me every day those first few weeks, and each time he told me I was stronger than I thought, I almost believed him. He's got Daniel's kindness, but softer, somehow more gentle. He would stop by after work, mow the lawn without being asked, bring me takeout when he knew I hadn't eaten. He made sure I kept moving. I clung to that to him. It was around that time he told me he'd met someone. Emily. He said her name like it was the answer to everything that hurt. The first time he brought her over, I couldn't deny she was beautiful. Polished and graceful with glossy dark hair and a laugh that turned heads in the room. She wore a pale blue dress and carried herself like she already belonged here. That first dinner, she charmed me without even trying. She refilled my water glass before I could ask. She complimented the tablecloth and told me she'd always wanted to visit Savannah. She held Lucas's hand across the table and smiled at him like he was the only man in the world. She made it so easy to believe she truly loved him. But even then, even in those early moments, something in my chest tightened when I watched her. I'd catch her eyes flicking to the silver candlesticks on the sideboard or the painting over the fireplace. There was a sharpness to the way she looked at things, a quick, calculating little glance before her smile came back. It was subtle, almost nothing, but it was there. I told myself I was being silly. I blamed my grief, told myself it made me suspicious, bitter, seeing things that weren't really there. The last thing I wanted was to turn into one of those mothers who resents the woman her son chooses. So I smiled when I didn't feel like smiling. I thanked her when she helped clear the table. I told her I was happy for them when Lucas looked at me with that hopeful little smile. But later, lying in bed, I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder if Daniel would have seen it too. That little flicker of something under all her charm. that tiny hint of hunger behind her perfect smile. I wanted to believe she was everything she appeared to be, but a part of me deep down wasn't so sure. The night before the wedding, we gathered at a little Italian restaurant Lucas loved. It was all warm wood and checkered tablecloths with the smell of garlic hanging in the air. Everyone was laughing and clinking glasses, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling building in my chest as I watched Emily work the room. She was radiant, of course. That dark, glossy hair fell over her shoulders, just so, and her black dress was understated but elegant, the kind of thing you knew cost more than it let on. She smiled at everyone like she'd known them for years, leaned into their stories with soft laughs, and even filled my water glass before the waiter could. When she spoke to me, her voice was sweet and smooth as honey, calling me Miss Claire and telling me what a wonderful job I'd done raising Lucas. She even reached over and squeezed my hand as if we shared some quiet understanding. I smiled back because that was what was expected, but my fingers curled slightly against hers. I kept catching her eyes as the night went on, and each time they darted quickly from my ring to my earrings, then to the candlesticks at the table next to ours. It was subtle, just little flickers, but her gaze was sharp, cataloging everything she saw. Every once in a while, she'd glance at the other diners too, but it wasn't in a friendly way. It was like she was measuring herself against them, taking notes. I told myself I was imagining it, that grief had made me overprotective and suspicious. It's natural, I thought, for a mother to feel replaced. So I forced a smile, forced my voice to sound warm as I asked her about her parents and her plans for the honeymoon. But under the table, my hands stayed tightly clasped in my lap, holding on to that strange unease I couldn't quite name. The wedding day was everything Lucas had dreamed it would be. The botanical garden was filled with roses in full bloom, the air heavy with their scent as sunlight poured through the trees. Watching him at the altar, his face glowing with a happiness I hadn't seen since he was a boy, brought tears to my eyes and a deep ache to my heart. I'd spent weeks planning my little surprise. Tucked into my purse was a card with a check inside, more money than he would ever expect, a way to give him and Emily the perfect start to their new life. It felt like the kind of grand gesture Daniel would have made, a way to honor him and his love for family. The ceremony blurred by in a haze of white lace and champagne toasts. Later, as everyone settled into the reception, I found myself seated at the head table watching them glide across the dance floor. Emily's dress shimmered under the lights as she leaned close to Lucas, whispering something that made him laugh. They looked beautiful together, the picture of a happy young couple. When it was time for my speech, I stood with my note cards in hand, my voice already thick with emotion. I spoke of Lucas as a little boy and of the man his father would have been so proud of today. I was just about to mention the gift, to tell them how Daniel had made sure their future would be secure. Then my eyes drifted to Emily. Her smile was dazzling for the crowd, but her eyes were fixed on me with a sharpness that froze me in place. It was the same glance from the restaurant, but stronger now, full of expectation and something colder beneath the surface. My breath caught as I looked back at Lucas's trusting face. In that moment, some quiet part of me screamed not to do it. I set the note cards down, raised my glass, and simply wished them a lifetime of love and happiness. My heart was pounding, but for the first time in months, I felt like I'd made the right choice. 3 days after the wedding, I heard a hard knock on my front door. It wasn't the friendly, kind neighbors give or even Lucas's familiar rhythm. When I opened it, Emily was standing there in a tailored charcoal suit, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and her eyes colder than I'd ever seen them. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Behind her stood a man I'd never met, holding a briefcase and wearing the same kind of dark, impassive expression you see in courtroom dramas. Emily brushed past me into my living room like she owned the place and sat down in Daniel's old chair without asking. She crossed her legs and motioned for the man to step forward. He set his briefcase on my coffee table, unlatched it, and pulled out a neat stack of papers. Emily didn't even look at me when she spoke, just smoothed her skirt and started explaining how the trust would make everything simpler. She talked about my future care as if I was already too frail to make decisions, her tone clipped and businesslike. I stared down at the words on the page as the blood pounded in my ears. Every line on that document was another way to erase me, to take away what Daniel and I had built together and put it in her hands. My hands trembled, but not with fear. It was rage, hot and sharp, bubbling just under my skin. She really thought I'd just sign smile and thank her for taking control. I forced myself to nod and mutter something about needing my glasses, but inside I was screaming. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about protecting my home. This was war, and Emily had just fired the first shot. As soon as Emily and her notary left, I sat there staring at the papers, my hands still trembling from holding them. The quiet of the house pressed down on me heavier than it had ever felt before. After a few minutes, I picked up the phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Arthur's name. Arthur had been Daniel's lawyer and closest friend for over 30 years. His warm, steady voice answered on the second ring, and the moment I heard it, all the words I'd been holding back came rushing out. I told him everything from the knock on the door to the way Emily sat in my living room and called it my future care. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Then Arthur's tone shifted sharper now, almost cold. He told me to bring him the documents first thing in the morning and not to sign a single thing. Then he added something that stopped me in my tracks. He said Daniel hadn't just left me comfortable. The estate, once fully accounted for, was worth over $6 million, and every penny was under my name. I sat there gripping the phone as his words sank in. Emily's little performance wasn't about helping me at all. She was trying to take everything, and she was counting on me being too weak or too grief-stricken to stop her. Arthur's voice softened again, before he hung up, telling me I was stronger than I thought. I set the phone down and took a deep breath. For the first time since Daniel passed, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. Something hard and steady settled in my chest as I looked at those papers on the table. I wasn't about to let her win. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the notary papers and letting my hands shake just enough to feel believable. When Emily called to follow up, her voice was all sugar again, asking if I'd had time to think things over. I let out a weary sigh, told her she was right, and said I didn't want to be a burden to Lucas. That was all she needed to hear before she invited herself over the next afternoon. When she arrived, I played my part perfectly. I wrung my hands, fretted about the paperwork, and told her how confusing it all seemed. She patted my arm and told me not to worry, that she and Lucas would take care of everything now. That's when I lowered my voice and leaned in like I was sharing a secret I hadn't even told my son. I told her Daniel used to take trips to the Cayman Islands. Said he called it his rainy day fund and kept it quiet because of taxes. Her eyes lit up at the mention of it, and she couldn't hide the little flash of hunger that crossed her face before she smiled again. I let her believe I had no idea where the documents for it were, only that I'd kept a key somewhere safe. That night she called again, her voice sharper this time. She told me to find that key, told me time was of the essence, and reminded me how dangerous it was to let accounts like that sit unclaimed. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear and listened as she spoke faster, her words tumbling over each other as she explained how it would all be safer under her name. While she talked, I quietly tapped the little recording app Arthur had installed on my phone. Her voice kept spilling into the line, saying exactly what I needed her to say. When I finally hung up, I stared at the screen, watching the seconds tick on the recording, and felt a calm settle over me. She thought she was tightening the noose, but what she didn't know was that I was the one pulling the rope. Arthur called me 2 days later, his voice low but steady. He told me the private investigator had finished his preliminary work, and it was worse than either of us expected. Emily wasn't just ambitious. She was a predator who had done this before. The report arrived at Arthur's office in a thin manila file, but it felt heavy when he handed it to me. Inside were copies of marriage records, annulment papers, and bank transfers that painted the picture of a practiced scheme. 3 years earlier, she had married a 72-year-old widower with a sizable estate, convinced him to sign over power of attorney, drained his accounts, and walked away after the marriage was annulled on grounds of fraud. The notes even included testimony from the man's son, who confirmed his father was now living in a small assisted living apartment, stripped of everything he'd worked for. There were also records of lawsuits, failed businesses under her maiden name, and a list of creditors still trying to recover what they could. It was a long, damning trail of deceit. I sat in Arthur's office reading every page, slowly letting the words sink in. The little flashes of calculation I'd noticed in her eyes that first dinner weren't my imagination. They were who she really was. When I reached the final page, I closed the file and felt a strange calm spread through me. That night at home, I began building my own copy of the dossier. I put every document in order, added the audio recording of her pressing me about the offshore account, and tucked it all neatly into a blue folder. I even labeled it with her name in clean black letters across the front. As I slid it into my desk drawer, I pictured her perfect little smile cracking when she finally saw it. The evidence was ready. Now all I had to do was wait for the right moment to show her exactly what I knew. I set the dining room table that evening as if nothing was wrong. The good china gleamed under the chandelier, and I'd even ironed the white linen napkins, just like Daniel used to like. A roast chicken sat in the center of the table, the smell filling the house and making it feel almost warm again. When the doorbell rang, I smoothed my skirt and pasted on the softest smile I could manage. Lucas came in first, looking relieved, his shoulders dropping like he thought the storm had finally passed. Emily followed close behind, her cream blouse crisp, her lips painted into a perfect, confident smile. We sat down together, and I poured tea while Emily chattered about how this was for the best, how it would make things so much easier for me. I kept my eyes lowered and nodded at all the right moments, letting her believe every word was sinking in. When she reached across the table to pat my hand and tell me how glad she was, I'd come around. I even gave her a little laugh. I asked questions about the trust with the kind of wide-eyed confusion she expected, leaning on her to explain things slowly like I couldn't keep up. Each time she answered, she looked more sure of herself, more smug, as though she was already sitting at the head of the table. Lucas just watched us, smiling faintly, completely unaware of the current running beneath the surface. After dessert, Emily finally set her teacup down and folded her hands neatly on the table, her voice dropping to a gentle firmness as she said it was time to sign the papers. I hesitated just enough to make her eyes glimmer with victory, then nodded weakly. She leaned back in her chair, her smile stretching wider, and for a moment she really believed she'd won. Sitting there in that quiet room, I let her believe it. But inside, I was already holding the weight of the blue folder in my mind, already feeling the shift in power that was about to come crashing down. I let the silence linger just long enough to feel heavy before I finally pushed my chair back and stood. Emily's eyes followed me, still full of triumph, and Lucas looked confused as I walked to the sideboard. I opened the drawer slowly and pulled out the blue folder, laying it gently on the table in front of them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told them there was one more thing they should probably see before I signed anything. Emily's smile faltered for the first time as I opened the folder and began to read. I started with the bankruptcy filings under her father's name, the trail of failed businesses, the lawsuits, the gambling debts. Then I moved to the annulled marriage with the elderly widower and the money she drained before walking away. Emily's fingers tightened on her napkin, and her face went pale as I laid each page out in front of her. Finally, I set my phone on the table and pressed play, Her own voice filled the quiet room, cold and calculating, telling me to find the Cayman account and move everything under her name so no one else could touch it. Lucas's eyes widened as he stared at the phone, his face draining of color as the truth sank in. When the recording stopped, the only sound was Emily's sharp breath as she stood shoving her chair back. Her mask cracked completely, her voice rising as she hurled insults at me, and then turned on Lucas, calling him weak, calling us pathetic. She grabbed her purse, her heels clicking against the floor as she stormed toward the door. Lucas didn't follow her. He just sat there staring at the papers on the table, his hands limp in his lap. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were full of shame and his voice broke as he whispered that he was sorry. I didn't say anything yet. Not then. I just sat back down calm and steady and let him sit there in the truth he hadn't wanted to see. Justice had finally found its way into the room. 1 year later, I was sitting on the terrace of a little villa in Carmel, watching the sun melt into the Pacific. The air was warm and salty, and for the first time in a long while, I felt completely at peace. Moving out here was something Daniel and I used to talk about but never got around to, and now it felt like the perfect way to begin again. Lucas calls me every Sunday now. His voice is softer when he speaks to me, more thoughtful somehow, and I can tell he's trying to rebuild what he almost threw away. Last month, he even sent me a picture of a certificate from a finance course he'd completed with a little note underneath saying one step at a time. I smiled when I read it, proud of him, but also proud of myself. This past year taught me that I am stronger than I ever believed, that quiet doesn't mean weak, and that letting someone walk all over you is never love. I still think of Daniel sometimes when the house feels too quiet, but now it's a peaceful, quiet one. I've chosen one I control. Sitting here looking out at the water, I know I saved more than just my husband's legacy. I saved myself. Now I have to ask you something. If you had been in my place watching your own son let someone hurt you like that, would you have done what I did? Would you have fought back and made him earn your forgiveness? Or would you have given it freely and let love come first? I'd really love to know what you think, so tell me in the comments. Type A if you believe forgiveness should always be unconditional. Type B if you believe tough love is sometimes the only way to truly protect the people you care about.